I'm Khoi, and this is Kaveh Akbar. And he is a poet and an essayist and a critic and an editor and an anthologist, teacher, and now he's a novelist. And his debut novel made every list that counts, best books of 24, every list that counts, and was a finalist for the National Book Award. So it's such a treat for us to have him here. Thank you very much.
That's an incredible intro. Yeah, no, it's very lucky. He's many of your cardiologists, I've learned. So
that's right. So if you call my office now, you're not going to get
yeah.
You're not going to get any joy.
That's pretty cool too. I mean, so, that's you're no slouch yourself.
Your life story is pretty. So you were born in Tehran.
I was born in Iran in 1989, in the middle of a blizzard. And came to America when I was a little kid.
So tell me about your parents. Like, how did that come?
Yeah, so my parents. Sorry, I have a bad back, so you'll see me squirming around. I promise I'm fine. It's just, yeah. We're all. I know. Wrong kind of doctor, but yeah, we're all. We're all beautiful, immortal animals. We're all beautiful, immortal souls. What is the Yeats line? Sick with desire and fastened to a dying animal, right? It doesn't matter. Anyways, that's me. Yeah, so what was I talking about? Oh, my parents.
Your parents.
So my dad is Iranian. He came to America after his military service in the 70s. He worked on poultry farms his whole life. There's a character in the book, there's a father in the book who works on a chicken farm, but you'll know that the book is not autobiographical because my dad worked on duck farms. When he came to America, he worked on duck farms. So totally not autobiographical. But yeah, there was a period where my dad actually was working on a chicken farm briefly, and a sort of like research chicken farm. And my mom was attending classes at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. And she took a poultry science class, and for the first day of her poultry science class, they had to bring in live chickens, and the students had to slaughter the chickens and take certain carcass measurements, And my mom is, a stiff breeze could blow her away. She's just like a very small, gentle thing. And so she was really struggling to kill her chicken because she was trying to do it humanely, which, as it turns out, is exactly the wrong way to humanely kill a chicken. And so my dad went over and helped her kill her chicken, and that is their meet cute. That is how they met. They met, they had my brother, and then they went back to Iran, had me, stayed for a bit, and then came back to America.
So your mother was willing to move to
Yeah,
Iran,
she spoke fluent Farsi before she got to Iran.
And she studied that in...
No. He was just a guy she fell in love with, and she was like, I'll meet you where you're at instead of forcing you to meet me here.
Wow. So you were born there, and then you came when you said you were about 2.5?
Yeah, 2.5, 3, yeah.
Yeah, and went to the great Midwest.
Yeah, well, we started out in Pennsylvania, then New Jersey, but we quickly moved to Milwaukee and spent a good, which is why my sports allegiances were formed in that era. So I'm a big Bucks fan, to a lesser extent a Packers fan. I was a big Packers fan when I was a kid, but then we had like Brett Favre and then Aaron Rodgers, who were two very unsavory characters, and so it became a little bit excruciating to be a Packers fan.
But I have to say, your first published poem was about the Packers.
How do you know? Okay, I can't. I've been publishing books and sort of in the public sphere for half my life now. Just mostly I was doing poetry books that, a tiny cadre of people way out in the margins of human interest cared about, and that was fine. Like, I like my little
I live
Hamlet.
on the margins.
Yeah, same. I like my little Hamlet way out in the margins of human interest. But so I've done a lot of, conversations with people, and I've never done a conversation with someone as prepared as he is. Like for real. Like he knew my spouse's name. He knew like where I went to high school. It was like, this is incredible. And none of this is secret, but neither is it stuff that I just casually mention. So.
Get used to it with this new administration. Okay?
Well, no, I'm just saying, like, imagine. So like if this is what he does for an interview, imagine like, you know, the details that don't get missed on your charts and stuff like that when so yeah, so
But but this one you published when you were like in
yeah,
second
yeah, yeah.
grade,
So my
right?
first published poem, this is true, was a poem called A Packer Poem in the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. I think I was in second grade, and
Yes, you were.
Yeah, yes I was. And I don't remember a lot of the poem, but I remember the last couplet was because, or not even the last couplet, the last line was because the fans and the players are brothers. And I was like, right, you know, like so still kind of holds up. I peaked early.
So you started writing poetry like really young.
Yeah. Well, so like I learned to write English kind of concurrently as learning to speak it, right? You know, because I had Farsi, and then coming to America, I was learning the orthography of the letters as I learned the semantic content of the language, right? And so that is not normal for a child who's organically learning a language, right? And so it was this fun, and my mom would always, I write about this in the book, and I've spoken about this elsewhere, so I'm sure you've heard me tell it. But my mom would get these SAT, do you guys do ACTs or SATs here? I don't remember. Both, neither. Some of you are saying neither, some of you are saying both. I don't know what that means, but I was in SAT country, and so my mom would get these SAT prep books from the library, and back then, the SATs have changed. I used to teach SAT prep at this Chinese school, but back then, there was like a word bank, and these were all the possible words that could be on the SAT in the analogy section. So like if you just learn this finite list, you could know everything that might possibly be on the SAT. And so she was just getting a head start and started just like teaching them to herself and peppering them into her vocabulary when she spoke to us. And consequently, I was the kid in school who was like, I'm feeling corruptible today instead of like I'm feeling strange. You know what I mean? Like I would just say like, I'm ambiguous about which, cookie I want, right? Like, and I didn't have a hierarchy of the language, right? I was learning it all concurrently, so I didn't know that certain words were the fancy words and certain words were the...
Must have made you really popular.
Yeah, well, so I genuinely did get really self-conscious about it,
Yeah.
and you know what it actually was I started learning that the words that I heard on TV were the words that you're supposed to say to people, and the words that I only read in books, but I never heard on TV were the words that you don't say out loud, you just write,
Right.
And so like I very, very consciously started curating my affect to match what I was hearing on TV.
I thought it was cool that you had developed this talent at such a young age, because there was a movie years ago about a precocious child poet.
The kindergarten teacher?
The kindergarten teacher.
God, yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so about this child.
Thank you
and
so much. I appreciate it. Round of applause for our good friend.
Yeah. So they needed poems that were believable so they asked you and Ocean Vuong to write the poems for this movie.
Yeah. You guys can still watch. As far as I know, it's still on Netflix. But it's a good movie. It's like a Maggie Gyllenhaal movie where there's like a precocious 5 or 6-year-old poet who's the sort of conceit of the movie is that he's this wunderkind poet, and so they needed poems that sounded like actual good poems. Like they couldn't just be like, I feel sad when I see the moon, or or whatever. Like they had to sound like good literary poems.
But they couldn't be too good.
Right. So like it was actually. I mean, in the way. Sorry, this is like really poetry nerdy, but in the way that working in a received form like an ode or a villanelle or a sestina is fun to write because of the strictures, right? Like Frost calls free verse tennis without the net, right? Like you need some sort of oppositional foil.
Some structure.
Some structure, right? Like his argument is that you need some sort of structure to make it interesting, right? And the structure of writing, because they had to be really short because, you don't get a lot of temporal real estate in a film to just deliver your 5-year-old's poetry, right? And so they need to be really short poems. They need to be good literarily, and they need to only use idiom and vernacular that would be native to the consciousness of a 5-year-old, right? So like I couldn't say things like corruptible or ambiguous, right? Like it had to sort of be these very sort of staccato bursts of monosyllables and lions, and like these sort of almost totemic images, right? And so it was actually a really interesting form, yeah. And Ocean and I had a lot of fun writing those poems.
Did Packer poem show up?
No, believe it or not, Maggie nixed the Packer poem. I tried to slip it in there, but left on the cutting room floor.
Be careful when you look for it, because there are actually 2 films by that name, because it was first made in Israel.
Yeah.
And it's that the other
and the
one
poems in the original version are bad. Like they didn't do the thing that Maggie thought, because Maggie's like a real poetry person. Like she's been to readings I've seen her at in New York and stuff like that. She's like a real person who actually likes poetry, and so she, I think rightly. Sorry, I don't mean to be whatever, it's fine. But like if you listen to the poems in the original, they're not good, and it kind of like strains credulity, because they're like, what? No one would be like, this sounds like a poem a 5-year-old would write, right? And so Maggie rightly was like, what this movie will need for us to believe that this character would be that excited about his poetry is for his poems to actually sound kind of remarkable,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was thinking about, I came over to this country, and we actually settled in Indiana.
Yeah,
and so we
were talking about this earlier.
I was the only Asian kid in my high school, which is can be problematic at times. And I was thinking, you are also in Indiana, and you have, like me, you have a funny name.
Yeah.
And you're 12 years old when 9/11 happens.
Yeah.
What was that?
Yeah, I mean,
like?
it ran the gamut, right? I mean, there was one other Muslimish kid in my school district.
Muslimish.
Muslim. I mean, he was Pakistani. His name was Adil.
Oh.
We wish him well. I hope he was. I don't know where he is today. I hope he's doing great. Shout out Adil from Warsaw, Indiana. But yeah, he was hired because my dad hired his dad to work on the farm. Like my dad just worked on corporate duck farms, but like had some amount to hire other farm people working with him or whatever. So my dad hired Adil's dad, ostensibly, I guess, to have like another sort of, this is as close as we can come sort of friend.
But I was wondering about that phrase, we did it to Hiroshima.
Yeah. You mean like in the palace? Sure. So in one of my, I'm like trying to keep up with you talking about my work. So there's a long poem at the end of my second book of poems that also appeared in the New Yorker.
Yeah.
They did like really cool illustrations and stuff for it. It's really cool if you want to Google it later. Not because the poem is so great, but because the illustrations and presentations that they did for it is really beautiful. Called The Palace.
Yes, because the New Yorker sometimes puts really crappy poetry in there.
Well, I mean, I'm not being like, you should all go Google my work afterward, like
but
that's absurd. But it is, they did do a beautiful job with that poem. And there's a line in that poem recounting a news article that I had seen about a kid who wore a shirt to school wearing, "We did it to Hiroshima, we can do it to Tehran," right? Which is like, it was from, I don't know what, like 10, 15 years ago now, but one could imagine a kid wearing that shirt today, and he was asked to turn his shirt inside out, and then his parents sued the school district, right? And this is like, this is like an elementary, like he didn't know what it meant, like he had no concept of what it meant, right? This was purely a staging ground for the parents, right? But so there's this sort of, there's that, but there's also this sort of valence of, I had a math teacher in high school I was like a stereotypical, Middle Eastern wonder kid, mathy, science, like SAT kid, until I discovered poetry, and then I quickly discovered drugs, as a poet does, and then and then I was no longer on that track. But for a while, I was like a mathlete and an academic Super Bowl and all that. And I remember my academic Super Bowl coach for my math academic Super Bowl team. So we were kind of close, right? Like I was the captain of the team, and he kept me after one day and was like, "I heard a word for people like you," and I was like, "What?" And he said, "The sand N word," like he said sand and the N word, right? And then like laughed like it was like you know, like a thing that we might share, you know, like
that's
it
in
was
Martyr,
like,
right?
yeah, and it, but it
Heavens
was
of
like,
Cyrus, yeah.
yeah, and it's like I can share this sort of artifact because it is true, and like in the moment, like like what pisses me off about it is not him, because that's like a simple, there's not a lot of depths to that sort of shittiness. It's just shitty, but what makes me wince now is like what was so not Persian or not whatever he perceived me to be about me that made him feel like I would laugh. You know what I mean? That made him feel like he could share that with me. You know what I mean?
Passivity that was
Yeah.
implied.
Like that I must have been somehow insufficiently Muslim or insufficiently Persian because he perceived me as someone who would laugh at this with him. But I share this also to say that like there's a way in which I could fill my work with stuff like that, but then I'm really conscious of a kind of, I think that the American, sorry, this is gonna get a little soapboxy, but I promise I'll bring it back. There's a way in which the American literary appetite often feels as if it rises in proportion to its perception of a person's proximity to state violence, right? Which is to say, as an author's proximity or perceived proximity to state violence increases, so too does the neoliberal literary appetite for that author's work, right? This feels, I think, do you understand what I'm saying? Right. So like, no, it's fine. So like after 45's travel ban thing went in, I don't like saying his name. I feel like he gets like an eldritch shiver of pleasure every time anyone says it anywhere. But like after 45's travel ban went in place the first time, like people started soliciting me for work, like really, really aggressively, right? Because Iran was one of the travel ban lists, and I'm, you know, I was an Iranian poet that people knew the names of in the literary sphere. And I was aware that my work hadn't changed. You know, I'm still writing about the same, you know, it was something else that had changed, right? And I'm saying this, I'm sort of extrapolating this phenomenon out, you know, writ large, right? So again, as a person's perceived proximity to state violence increases, so too does a certain kind of neoliberal literary appetite, right? I think it is enmeshed in what one might call the politics of personal exoneration. I think that's a phrase from Coates. The politics of personal exoneration. In other words, like I am reading this book and therefore I'm one of the good ones and I am exempted from the harm that it describes. And I'm much more interested in creating a spectrum of relationality which says like, I'm fucked and so are you, what do we do about it? You know, no, for real, as opposed to saying like, here I am standing in the moral high ground, and these are what the bad people look like, and this is what the good person looks like. Come be like me, you know what I mean? And like once you sort of like self-flagellated enough or like endlessly reprocessed your own subject position relative to your privilege or whatever, like that doesn't get anyone free, right? Like what gets people free is like coalition building across class and across race and stuff like, you know, and that only happens if people move past the endless self-flagellation or endless finger pointing and just say like, I'm fucked, so are you. What do we do about it? Like I'm sitting, you know, like I have no idea who funded this. I'm sure it's not great. Like, I mean, shout out all the donors. You're all fine, I'm sure. But you know what I mean? Like I'm wearing Adidas shoes. I'm like, you know, like I flew on a jet here. No, for real. Like I flew on an American Airlines jet here. They put 70 tons of carbon into the air every year. 70 million tons of carbon into the air every year, right? Like I'm not exempt from any of this shit. Like I'm saying like I'm complicit and so are all of you. What do we do about it? And I'm much more interested in that kind of literature. And I think that those totemic things like the teacher saying that thing to me, while true, also give people a kind of exemption and say like, well, I never called someone that. So so like now I get to sit comfortably as one of the good ones, having vented off some necessary agitation. Does that make sense?
It does, and I think it's so, one of the things I really admired about your career and your trajectory is that I think of poetry as somehow inherently isolated, like people read poetry alone and they write it, and it's so clear that you always saw poetry as a gateway to a community, you know, starting with the quirk.
Holy shit, yes. Literally my high school zine that I made, like...
You know, but like, don't make me feel creepy. Okay?
No. I actually don't know, like a zine that I made in high school. Like,
but it was a zine where you as a 17-year-old, you're reaching out to like world famous poets
Yeah.
and interviewing them. Like, who has the moxie to do that? But you always saw this. It seemed like it was always about building community.
Yeah. Well, it's salvific. I mean, if you're like, you must be able to relate to this in some capacity, right? Like, I was not.
If you say it slowly, maybe.
No, sorry. Sorry, I get excited. I care about, I know that it's like I'm sitting on a stage and I'm supposed to be like hawking my wares and kissing babies, but like I really care about this stuff. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I really, no
Right.
bullshit, care about this stuff. Like, when I was a teenager in Warsaw, Indiana, I did not feel particularly attached to remaining alive. Like, the things that keep a normal person, like, I wasn't particularly connected with my family. You know, I was not particularly ambitious in any like I wasn't like, oh, I'm gonna be a doctor and go to Harvard or whatever. You know, like I don't know, like the things that keep a regular person, I don't think I really had access to. And then I had a...
You didn't say that because I'm a doctor and I went to
No,
Harvard.
I'm sorry. Did you really go to Harvard?
Yeah.
Oh, shit, I'm sorry. No, I'm at Yale or whatever.
I was like, wow, you did your homework.
No, listen, that's one of those like even a broken clock things. No, I'm sorry. My mom is still holding out hope that I'll eventually drop all this and become you. Yeah, I mean, I am a doctor. Like, I did eventually get it. Like, I have so many degrees in this that all amount to whatever. But what was I talking about?
But you were talking about connectivity and community.
Yeah. But then, I had a high school teacher read, the poem was called Facing It by the poet Yusuf Komunyakaa. But he read this poem to us in class, just like an offhand, like it wasn't even like a poetry unit. It was just like, here's a poem that I like and I'm gonna read it to you guys. And I'm getting, I don't know if you guys can see that. I'm getting goosebumps talking about it. It was like, I was like, oh, that, what was that just happened inside me, right? And I asked him for the book, and he sent me home. His name was Steve Henn, a really important figure in my life, Henn. But he sent me home with a stack of poetry books, and I remember reading them, and it was like, oh, this is what I am, right?
So you reached out to the poet.
Well, I reached out to him, but I actually did, yeah. So I had been running a little local general interest journal called The Quirk, right?
Yeah.
A little zine where I would get my friends to publish music reviews, and I would draw comics and write stupid little whatevers. And then as I got more and more into poetry, I started, this was back when you could go on like Yahoo Yellow Pages and just look up anyone's phone number, right? Because it was like post ubiquity of the internet, pre-ubiquity of cell phones, right? And so like everyone still had landlines. And so I would just I was like too dumb and ignorant of this field to know that this wasn't a thing you were allowed to do. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I would just I wrote to Yusuf Komunyakaa, and I wrote to Sharon Olds, and I wrote to Robert Bly and W.D. Snodgrass and Naomi Shihab Nye, and just truly I lived in the 811.5 section, and when I got excited, I would write to the person and be like, I'm excited. And often Yusuf Komunyakaa gave me an interview that I ran in Quirk 2 and sent me several new poems. Robert Bly, I was a 17-year-old kid who could do them no good.
I feel like that's remained a consistent theme.
Yeah.
Through that, like Dive Dapper, it's another website that you created, was all these.
But it remains
interviews.
a consistent theme through art. And nobody, that's not true.
No.
But none of us are going to become millionaires off of our poetry. You know what I mean? Like the way that this art has perpetuated. You know who the first poet who ever made a living as a poet, you know who it was? Anyone? Did someone say it? Simonides? I thought I maybe heard it. Maybe I was. Simonides was this Greek poet, and he made money. He made a living as a poet by writing epitaphs for people. Families would hire him to write their epitaphs, right? So we've always had to find these hustles.
Aren't
right?
you glad you didn't say E. Cummings or something like that?
The first poet, E. Cummings in the 20th century. No, I put together this anthology of spiritual verse for Penguin concurrently with writing this novel called the Penguin Anthology of Spiritual Verse for 110 Poets on the Divine. It's changed titles so many times, but yeah, it's called the Penguin Anthology of Spiritual Verse, 110 Poets on the Divine. And it is, the process of me tracking 43 centuries of this project of like right from the earliest attributable author of our species, Enheduanna, who is the Sumerian priestess, all the way through Gilgamesh and the Bhagavad Gita, and and in that process, you learn that this is not something that people have really ever done to great acclaim or to you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And yet, like there was a period in human history when Rumi and Dante were alive concurrently looking at the same stars.
But
right?
yet their work endures. Though,
Yeah,
too,
but that's
right?
what I'm saying. Because I mean, I don't know. I think that when I talk to a lot of my students today, they feel very immobilized by the magnitude of the crises facing us, which is totally reasonable. And because of what they are told they're doing, right? Which is they're entering into a conversation that has preceded them by millennia that will continue long after the last person forgets their name, right? Yeah. Which is true of all of us. And I mean, sometimes I have skepticism about like the end date of like humanity, you know what I mean? Like we've had atomic weapons for less than 100 years and we've used them twice, but I don't know. What am I talking about? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, you.
I don't remember what
You're
I was
paid
talking
to be here.
about.
You talk.
No, I can't remember what I was talking about exactly. Just the the immobilizing effect of your aperture being wide enough to perceive all of these interlocking apocalypses. Like we're teetering on the precipice of ecological collapse, and the rising specter of fascism is taking over across the world, and and every student sits down in the wake of all of that, and they're like sitting there with their pen being like, all right, how do I write the poem that addresses all of this, and also my parents' divorce, and also the legacies of chattel slavery and indigenous genocide in this country and nuclear proliferation, you know what I mean? And it's impossible, right? Like if your aperture is that wide, you're never gonna write anything, right? And I think that understanding the magnitude of history, like how many people in this room are reading Patakara today or Mahadevyaka, despite the fact that those people had like those are poets who had literal temples erected to them, you know what I mean?
And addressed issues.
And addressed issues, right? And so like it's very humbling, right? Like if Patakara couldn't figure it out, if Dante and Rumi and Phyllis Wheatley and Mahadevyaka couldn't figure it out, and John Donne couldn't figure it out in Shakespeare, then I'm not going to be the one who figures out how to apply the corrective language to man's soul, right? To stop our inhumanity. And so it makes my project, it makes my aperture a lot smaller.
See, now, I mean, we've talked about your chops as a poet and your in poetry, but Martyr, I would talk about that now. You switched into prose after devoting your life to poetry. What motivated the switch? Is it because why a novel?
There are poems in it still. So I sort of like, it was a little bit like, what's that awful, boiling the frog? Is that the expression? Yeah, where you just like sort of turn the water up until the frog doesn't, awful expression, but it's the one that leapt to mind. So I kind of like teased my way into it. And it kind of functions, I think of it, I don't know if people here are into musical theater.
But what was your motivation for even going that way?
Well, I had a narrative. I had a story that I wanted to tell. And while lyric can accommodate great narrative, you can look at the Iliad or the Aeneid or, the Bhagavad Gita or Gilgamesh, right? I am not Homer or Virgil or, you know what I mean? And so it was difficult for me to accommodate. I mean, like, and Rita Dove writes Thomas and Beulah, which is another great contemporary lyric narrative story. So I don't mean to say this is only the purview of antiquity, but my lyric tends to be quite associative and quite elliptical and could not accommodate the kind of story that I was trying to tell. And so I found myself writing in paragraphs, which was new for me. Newish. I mean, I'd written essays.
Did you feel like you had to acquire some
absolutely,
kind of narrative skills?
Absolutely. And I've spoken about this elsewhere too. But once I realized what I was doing, I started reading 2 novels a week and watching a movie a day as like this sort of foie gras goose narrative diet, just like forcing it all into myself.
How long did you do that for?
4 or 5 years. I mean, the duration of my, I occupy this very I'm a tenured professor, so like I have a very sultanic life where like I teach my favorite thing in the world twice a week and then like come home and think about it. You know what I mean? Like I have the time to write and to read.
And this was just to pick up narrative craft skills?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I have like 37 degrees in poetry, but none in fiction. And so I had to learn from, I always sort of half jokingly tell my students that they don't need me, they need a library card, right? And I'm sort of just the person who forces them to use it. I mean, like, that's what my education was I just read, and I read, like, there was no, like, my curatorial aesthetic was super, super lowercase c Catholic. Like, I would read a bunch of Agatha Christie mysteries and, like, just pulpy sci-fi paperbacks, and then I'd read, In Search of Lost Time, and then I'd read, whatever, which is actually reflective of how my mom, again, I keep coming back to my mom because she was really the language faucet in our house.
She had the library card.
Yeah, she had the library, for real.
Yeah,
she literally was the one with the library card. I don't think my dad still has the library card. No, he did because he could rent movies with
And
it.
so she would bring you these piles, you said, of books.
Yeah. She would bring me these, she would, like, go to the recently checked in piles, and that was how she curated for us. So it would be like, we'd get, like, Of Mice and Men next to a biography of Florence Nightingale, next to a book about pterodactyls, next to, like, a Clifford book, next to, and she would just bring home that stack, whatever had, the fourth book in the series of unfortunate events book, like, and whatever she brought home was what we read, right?
Well, you've spoken about, obviously I've trolled you speaking about this need to pick up these skills, but and I think it's with incredible humility because you never talk about the fact that, well, actually you had a lot of skills that you brought to prose writing that you had been honing through. I mean, incredible attentiveness to word and line and metaphor
generous.
and imagery. And,
I think that what poetry trained in me was my ear. The way that, watching a great dancer can train your ear, right? You don't even need to hear the music, right? Like, I think that you get that sort of embodied corporeal sense of that intuitive rhythm that the body follows. When you read, I make my students read the Psalms backwards all the time, or Morrison or Nabokov, or anyone who had that kind of, like, atomic understanding of how, our entire language is built around the sonic topography of the King James translation of the Psalms. And Morrison and Nabokov in Nabokov's English novels just rewrote that. Like they just, like, hear it so well that they are writing the Psalms. And if you read it backwards, you lose the semantic content of the language, but you preserve the rhythm perfectly. So it's easier to hear the rhythm if you read them backwards. But like, you can try that. I promise. Like, just go home and read Psalm 22 backwards. It's the exact same thing. Huh? No, not line by word by word. Yeah, so, like, you're denuding it of all of its semantic context, but you're preserving its rhythmic context.
Don't spell the words backwards. No.
No. Just pronounce. Yeah. I mean, just word by word, read them back. And truly, the same thing works with Morrison. The same thing works with Nabokov.
And
I mean,
when I started reading
Wolf.
about your thinking about this, I went and looked up, like, poets who became novelists, and it turned out it's quite a...
Yeah, I mean, it's not a novel thing. Alice Walker, Rilke was a poet. Rilke was a novelist. Berryman wrote a bad novel.
Michael Ondaatje.
Yeah, Ondaatje, yeah. He's a great example.
Right.
But I say this to say it trained that, but what it didn't train was, like, when you read The Bluest Eye, like, you're reading about Piccola Breedlove, and you're totally gripped by the language and the propulsivity of the story, but you're also, like, what you don't notice is that Morrison, like, by the end of that book, you can sketch Piccola Breedlove's house, right? Like, the floor plan. Like, you know exactly where the closets are. You know exactly where the bathroom is. You know what I mean? And that kind of, like, architectonic narrative structure is not something that I had any, that's not something that I had any correlative for in my lyric exploration. Does that make sense, right? So, like, learning how to get that sort of, like, plotty plot marbled in to the rhythms and to the sounds, like, getting people through doorways and, like, explaining how people pay for their, when you read Portrait of a Lady, like, James, I have a better understanding of James's character's finances than I have of my own. I mean that literally. I literally understand their finances better than I understand my own.
I think it's not just, like, the propulsivity of the narrative, but also, I was trying to think about this, like, scale. Like, if I read a medical chart, I'm really looking for clarity.
Yeah.
If
That's
I read poetry,
yeah.
Poetry forces me to be comfortable with ambiguity.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Right?
Yeah.
And so that's, like, the scale. And so when you were going from poetry to writing
That's beautiful.
a novel, I mean, you've written a lot of essays, and so your persuasive and clarity are important. But the novel, you could kind of play with this range between ambiguity and clarity, right?
Yeah, yeah, and I'm so, like, I love that. I mean, I think that that's really, really beautiful, and training myself to sit in uncertainty without groping desperately to resolve it has been one of the fundamental horizons towards which lots of my art and living have moved, frankly.
Yeah.
I think that the pathologization of cognitive dissonance in the 20th century has led to a lot of inorganic performances of certainty in the 21st century. You know, like the idea that if a person is thinking conflicting thoughts about a certain thing, then there's some pathology at root, there's some anxiety, or there's some, and if there is a person who thinks like one crystalline, monolithic, eclipsing thought in any moment, I certainly am not one of them. You know what I mean? Like any thought that I might have to say to you guys, like right now, this second, like the most anodyne thing I could do would be like take a sip of this water, right? And even doing that, I'm like, oh shit, they're gonna know I'm using a bottled water. You know, like they're gonna, is this about power? I'm making them all watch me be an animal. Like, no, for real, like all of these thoughts, and like all I'm doing is like the most basic thing. You see what I'm saying? There's nothing that happens in my mind that isn't accompanied by, a bouquet of skepticisms, and then like a bouquet, then like and I think that a lot of pain in my life and in the lives of people who love me has been caused by my trying to resolve those and be like, no, it is good that I drink this water, watch me. You know what I mean? Like, I'm saying this metaphorically, but like, that taken into a marriage or taken into a relationship with students or with fellows in recovery, for instance, right, can be a lot less cute, right?
Let's tell people, can you give people just like a quick summary of what the book is about?
Oh yeah, that's like an integral part of the whole hush. Yeah.
Before they leave.
There's a yeah, we're having a nice time. Why would we ruin it with that? There's a young man named Cyrus Shams who is recently sober, recently orphaned, who is sort of listlessly drifting from crisis to crisis. He's working as a medical actor, pretending to be dying patients so doctors can practice their empathy on him. And did you have to do that? Did you have to do?
But I read Leslie
Jameson's empathy exams. Yeah, so like half the doctors I meet have had to do that, and half have. My ophthalmologist said that he had to do that, and it's like it's a dark day when you're an ophthalmologist and have to break that news. But sorry. Oh, right, Cyrus. So Cyrus is a young man recently, my public, like I can see like the Knopf like laser sights on my chest right now getting ready to, they're just like, we gotta get him off stage. The Cyrus is a young man, recently orphaned, recently sober. He's a poet, and he's really obsessed with martyrdom. He's obsessed with historical martyrs, especially secular martyrs, because he doesn't feel particularly religious. And so he's obsessed with, and because he feels not particularly attached to remaining alive anymore, he's thinking that maybe the best net ethical thing that he can do for humanity is to give his life, right? If he's gonna commit suicide, why waste it, right? And so let me do it in some way that will be useful, whether that is
like everybody struggles with what to do with their life, and Cyrus struggles with
what to do with his death. Exactly,
right,
exactly. And so he's like researching historical martyrs. He's like, should I hurl myself through the window of a Bank of America? Should I kidnap a conservative Supreme Court justice? Like, and he's like, what is the thing that I, as one human being, can do that will create the most net ethical good in the world?
So Cyrus is this character which, at least superficially, has a lot of resemblance to the author. So he's born in Iran. Yeah. He's raised in Indiana. Yeah. His father does poultry.
Yeah. But his father does
a poet.
chickens.
He's in recovery, right? And then at one point, Cyrus, when his father's just died, he loses his mother.
That happens in the first 10 pages
but Cyrus
or 20
says,
pages. I'm a petulant toddler about spoilers, so I would check him.
But you said something that Cyrus, after his father died, that he realized that his life had no intrinsic meaning because he knew that such meaning could only be shaped in relation to others.
Literally a direct quote from the
Right.
book. Like he nailed it. He's not even paraphrasing. Like he memorized it.
Yeah.
This is insane.
What a coincidence.
Yeah.
No. So is Cyrus speaking for Cyrus, or is Cyrus speaking for Kaveh?
Oh, well,
With
there's
that,
such a...
It's
there's,
like this whole
yeah,
thing
there's
that
such
life
a
is
meta
only
thing.
have meaning in relation to others? Is that how you
there's-
feel?
Wow. It is how parts... I mean, the whole fun of fiction is that you can put your hands in
Right.
the sock puppets and like ventriloquize different parts of your brain, right?
Right.
Like, so... Like, of course, part of me thinks that life can only be formed in relation to others, and then like, you know, the counterpart, as I'm saying it, rises up to say, no, of course, one can build a meaningful life by themselves out in the woods, and then, you know, and then the counter, you know, and it's like,
Right, and the counter that you explore in the book is that that the counterpositive is that if you have a life that is connected, that it inherently has meaning. The great thing about art is that sometimes the reader can take something away that the writer didn't intend,
1000%,
right? But you can still get value out of it. And it made me think about James Baldwin's thing that every life is interconnected. So when one man goes, much more than the man goes with him.
yeah, oh, of course.
Right,
of
and
course.
that we are just that each person is actually just the custodian of something. He says a unique quality that has never existed before, never will exist again. So you are this custodian of this life, and I think that's what I got out of the novel so
course.
powerfully is how our decisions we make about our own lives, how it impacts other people who care for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And Cyrus is totally unable to see
Yeah.
how his removing himself from the world would create these, you know, howling cavities in the lives of the people around him, right?
Yeah.
Because he doesn't really perceive their interiorities with the fullness or magnitude that he perceives his own. I mean, not to step on your toes, but like neurologically, right? Like we store memories outside ourselves, right? Like we store memories in literature, right? We develop writing because our brains got too big to be able to birth good. So we develop communication and we develop intergenerational knowledge, and then we develop writing. And also, like, you know, when this is going to get dark for a second, but like people who have experienced the loss of a loved one, right, are aware that suddenly there are anecdotes that they've forgotten. You know what I mean? Like that loved one was the custodian of the anecdote about the one time in Baja, right? Like that they were the person who knew the Netflix password.
So come tomorrow, because we're going to explore that when we talk with
Right?
That's perfect.
Yeah.
I just, you had such a prominent role in the world of poetry, and then now your sphere of influence has only increased with the commercial and critical success of Martyr. Yeah, Kaveh is not going to mention this, but just a few months ago, he was named in Time's Next 100, or 100 Next, as one of the influential leaders in the emerging world, in the future world. And I just wonder, like, now but how do you,
the
how,
future
what do you
world
see,
is going to need a lot of like
so
ancient
what do you-
Mesopotamian poetry
do you
experts.
see that as do you see that as a real responsibility? And how do you have this influence now in this pulpit, this bully pulpit.
Yeah.
What are your intentions with that?
Yeah, I mean, I have to keep. I'm a person in recovery. This is not a secret. I write about it extensively. I've been sober for 11 years, and I have to keep my aperture very, very. Thank you. I have to keep my aperture very, very small, right? And it's like, I hope to be able to make each action with integrity. I'm having a sincerely wonderful time talking to you. We had a nice talk before we came here. After this, I'm going to go back to my hotel room and catch up on the faculty meeting that I missed today at the University of Iowa, and then I'm going to call my spouse, and then I might get dinner with Khoi.
He doesn't just write about being in recovery. He hosts writer groups for people.
I
and
went
you go
to.
to
I'm
halfway
not going
homes.
to.
He goes to jails.
I'm not going to name it because you guys know why I'm not going to name it. But I went to a recovery meeting this morning on Zoom. I'll go to another one tonight. But I'm saying this to say, like, the reason. The good that I make, whatever good that I make, is like 6 inches in front of my face, right? And I never have to look past, like, I'm having this conversation. I've never once in my life said I'll never shoot up again or I'll never drink again, right? I've only ever said, like, right now I'm talking to my new friend, and then I'm going to go sign some books. And if I just stick to those two things, I'm probably not going to accidentally fall on a needle. You know what I mean? And like I don't have to look past the next right thing. And that is how I've made it to 11 years, right?
All right.
Yeah.
Well, that's cool.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you very
I
much.
appreciate it. That was beautiful.
Thanks for coming.
That was incredible.
Oh, yeah.
You really, I've never been in a conversation like that. It was really cool.
Well, thanks.